first part of this two-part series, I described a problem, or perhaps more accurately, an observation regarding the normalization of the sexualization of children in the mainstream media, and more dire, the potential not only mere acceptance but ultimate outright support from far left-leaning radical organizations such as Antifa and other anarchist or communist organizations and thought leaders toward that end. I left you with the question of why and the proposal that it may have something to do with the history and support of extreme sexual behavior in the left and in left-leaning philosophical thought. I must admit, philosophy is not my strong suit, and as such, these are the kinds of topics that honestly I struggle with, and I struggle going into. I like numbers and data more than I like philosophizing. But history, hey, that's something I can get into. And as such, I wanted to examine the history of far left-leaning thought that may have led us to the current state of allowance, if not outright promotion, of child sexuality that we are seemingly seeing in greater frequency, coming not only from the extreme left, but, again, more disturbingly, from mainstream origins. For example, at this point, from even Obama's administration and from various Australian governances, the acceptance of safe school programs.
The word lesbian comes from the island of Lesbos, where Greek poet Sappho suggests a poem to women. Greek people encouraged homosexuality. In fact, it was considered normal for an adolescent boy to have an older, lighter man as his love.
Conceptualized by a man who thought it was appropriate, for example, again, to give out pamphlets on fisting, that's right, anal fisting, to 12-year-olds, and with the open praise of primary school-aged children for identifying as transgender. To, on a more mainstream level, again, the general increase in media of children being educated, or perhaps more accurately indoctrinated into a mindset of sexuality from an extremely early age. And as I showed in the last video, well, the effects are evident. Again, they are being exposed to this and are beginning to express sexual behaviors far before the onset of puberty. As such, we need to look at where this line of thinking originates in order to understand what may be causing it. Real quickly, I do want to mention that although I'm talking about pedophilia and sexualization of children coming from the left, it's not like pedophiles have never been more traditionally conservative or right-wing. In fact, it's kind of the only thing you typically can bring up when you talk about pedophilia, it seems, is talking about Catholic priests molesting kids, which they absolutely did.
I don't blame every priest when one touches a boy.
Let's afford that same respect to everyone else in the story.
They did in quite horrifying frequency, too. I suggest watching the documentary The Keepers. That'll wake you up. The fact of the matter is, though, is that was, while covered up by the Catholic archdiocese, churches and organizations, it was never accepted. It was never viewed as part of the mainstream. Those priests were still deviants. This is a little bit different. This is acceptance, and it comes from a place of philosophy that it just doesn't when it's happened on the right. A quick glance at any Antifa riot, or a quick question lobbed to any number of the screeching protesters out on the streets in their hatred of Trump about the invisible Nazis supposedly running rampant across this nation, will reveal an affinity for communism and socialism across the entire gamut. The Antifa fly the flag of anarcho-communism, for fuck's sake. The connection is not a difficult one to find, and when you start to look at the history of communist and socialist philosophy and thought, well, the association with sexual liberation, the destruction of the family, and ultimately the concept of monogamy as well as the outright worship of hedonism starts to become overwhelmingly evident and serves to explain why these individuals who call themselves commies or socialists, despite likely never having read the Communist Manifesto, to say nothing of Das Kapital, have also either learned to be accepting of this overt sexualization, and perhaps even adopted a willingness to add a P to the ever-growing LGBTQIAA+ acronym, given the beliefs and writings of their thought leaders over time, or are in contrast just clueless enough due to their lack or the obfuscation in their education about these realities of far left thought that they cannot see the very, very dangerous road this is leading down into the overt acceptance of pedophilia. You may think then, since we are talking about the roots of outright hedonic sexual expression to the point of including children into the beliefs present in modern-day communist and socialist movements, that it may make sense to start seemingly at the beginning. Where is the beginning? With Marx and Engels, right? And trust me, we will get to them, particularly to Engels. But the history of hedonic anti-Western thought, if you want to call it anti-Western, I sure would, but at least anti-Western thought in terms of the dissolution of everything regarding what we conceive of as traditional relationships, from monogamy to the sexualization of children actually begins a bit further back, with the likes of Charles Fourier. While Fourier believed women should be able to hold any position held by a man, he also thought that all labor, all activity, should be done for the purpose of seeking pleasure, and imagined a utopian world of essentially limitless sex, and even ongoing orgies whenever one felt like it. He believed marriage was limiting to women, and advocated not just for the dissolution of marriage, but for the concept of monogamy altogether, of a utopia defined for men, women, and children by his own words, of endless earthly pleasure, that the appeasal of the physical body and of the pleasure that it perceives is the ultimate purpose of human labor and ultimately existence. Hakim Bey, the anarchist NAMBLA member mentioned in the first part of this video series, writes of Fourier, quote, "In Fourier's system of harmony, all creative activity, including industry, craft, agriculture, etc., will arise from liberated passion. This is the famous theory of attractive labor. Fourier sexualizes work itself, the life of the phalanstry, a continual orgy of intense feeling, intellection, and activity, a society of lovers and wild enthusiasts." Well, imagine my shock. Of course it makes sense why Bey, a pedophile, would find the sexualization of all of life attractive, as it would allow for children and adult relationships to fall into that endless hedonism, into the fulfillment of sexual and physical desires, no matter what they may entail, no matter how repulsive or repugnant we, in our evil, Western, capitalist society, may perceive them to be, because obviously we're in the wrong, but hey, we'll get there. Fourier, though, preceded Marx and Engels, but his writing was influential to parts of their philosophy, particularly in his beliefs on the dissolution of the family and the relative liberation of women from an oppressive system of class division, such as he perceived it and such as Marx and Engels did as well. According to Marx and Engels, class division and alienation between the classes are the ultimate cause of the world's woes, and the only method of removing this division between the ruling classes, the bourgeoisie, and the working class, the proletariat, was the complete and total restructuring of society. And while this obviously, as most people know, involves the seizure of the means of production and the redistribution of all wealth in society in order to remove the instability and imbalance that they perceived as an inherent part of capitalism's class division, however, that is not all that was required. What is ultimately needed as a part of the final goal of communism is a restructuring on the most basic and fundamental levels of human society, starting with society's most simplistic collective unit, the family. In the Communist Manifesto, they write of the measures need be taken to establish the communist utopia, which, by the way, one line before this, they admit will be typified by violent despots in the transitional period. Like, has happened every single goddamn time communism has been attempted, given the necessity of a strong despot to seize the means. Gee, what have we seen in Venezuela? What did we see in the Soviet Union? What have we seen every time? The exact thing that Marx and Engels describe right here. A despot. Anyway, one of the measures that they also state as necessary is the total and complete abolition of all rights of inheritance, and another one, which is the necessity of the communal education of all children. Let's look at why these are important and what they have to do with the influence of Fourier on Marx and Engels' beliefs about how the communist system need operate. In Engels' book, The Origin of the Family, he writes that, based on his observation of the Iroquois Indians, early human society operated in a pseudo-socialist, perhaps even pseudo-communist if you want to call it, and actually more accurately, it operated in a way that was to be the ultimate goal of communism. The despotic state, that was to be transitionary. That's supposed to be working towards a true communist, true socialist state. What he's talking about with the Iroquois, this is the ultimate goal of a communist government. A matriarchal or matrilineal state, given that the establishment of paternity during this simplistic societies, I know that's probably a very rude thing to say, but these simple human societies, they were matrilineal and they lacked the capacity or the need of establishing paternity. Let's examine why. During this period that Engels perceives of or conceives of, women selected partners as needed to reproduce for the tribe, and the concept of monogamous relationships was absent in these early groups. Everyone just romped around, banging each other and living simple, happy lives, but everything changed when the idea of private property attacked.
Long ago, the four nations lived together in harmony. Then, everything changed when the
capitalism
attacked.
In the form of paternity, inheritance, and monogamy. As humans started to create objects, tools, and ultimately wealth, they wished to pass these things down onto their children so that their children may potentially benefit from the fruits of the labors of their fathers or mothers. But to Engels, this was the origin of all class division, with the first form of alienation, the original form of the class struggle, being in the subjugation of the woman and the child to the man in the family unit. Unlike the utopian socialist matriarchy or matrilineal society that he described with the Iroquois, at some point in this process of production, then desire to pass on their goods, society ceased in its sex orgy and moved into a system of monogamy, wherein men demanded paternity for the purpose of passing on an inheritance to their biological children. Everyone was just chilling out, maxing, relaxing, all cool, all peaceful like Indians before this happened.
Hey man, don't let them bring you down now. There's a lot of young people in this country just like myself who really know where the Indians at. And don't worry, soon we're all gonna be out here on the reservation, living like Indians and dressing like Indians and doing all the simple, beautiful things that you Indians do. You got any peyote?
This made women, and in this view children as well, subservient and divided as a class from men, given women now had to prove paternity on some level, and children had to survive their fathers, often having to take on not just their goods, but their work as well. Well, this just shows how men really do fuck everything up, because clearly, in this instance, although at the time Engels was certainly not advocating for any kind of extreme third-wave feminism, you can certainly draw it back to this, can you not, if you're paying a little bit close of attention, right? This means men and paternity and inheritance are all responsible, not just for all the woes of women, but for all the woes of the world. For if only we could get rid of the family, then we could get rid of all of the other class struggles, divisions, and alienation that we find in society, at least according to communist, Marxist thought. Given that some fathers collect more goods and then pass on those greater amount of goods to their children, those children therefore enter life with more goods and therefore more wealth and power and resources than children whose fathers, say, for instance, died young and were not able to produce as many goods to pass along through inheritance. According to Engels and clearly Marx, although arguably to a lesser extent, and we will get to that, inheritance therefore is the most basic unit of alienation, and the traditional family is the most basic unit of alienation of women and children in terms of the class struggle. What this same line of thinking would mean for later scholars is not just that the family and the monogamous relationships between men and women are not only the cause of all division and alienation as a tool and product of the bourgeoisie, of the ruling class, but precisely, once again, what feminist and leftist scholars see precisely as what the patriarchy is, and what many years later Marcuse would redefine as a class struggle from mere class into a sexual repression struggle. So hang on, because we're going to get into exactly what that means in terms of the philosophy. What this means in this case, though, is that the root of all division, alienation, and ultimately human suffering is the family unit. That families are the cause of suffering. And in a more expanded perception of it, men themselves are the cause of all suffering, out of their desire to provide for their offspring and ensure for their offspring's well-being. Well, men really aren't the fucking worst, am I right? Engels and Marx both advocated for public education of children in communal care, meaning that the society at large would take care of children without individual families taking care of their own kin. And it makes sense if the family unit needs be destroyed within a socialist matrilineal society under this communist utopian system. For again, it is the creation of the family that is ultimately the original source of class struggle, of all evil, division, and alienation, and further, as feminist scholars would later describe it, the patriarchy. In contrast, the elimination of the family unit and monogamous relationships will, as Engels states, quote, bring about the gradual growth of unconstrained sexual intercourse, and with it a more tolerant public opinion in regard to a maiden's honor and a woman's shame. Going on further to suggest that free and open sexuality, given that women need now not be concerned with the raising and care of children produced in this non-monogamous system of free sexuality, or, you know what, whatever, potentially just constant orgies, as this system would remove, quote Engels again, all the anxiety about the consequences, which today is the most essential social, moral, as well as economic factor that prevents a girl from giving herself completely to the man she loves. Well, see, this is how you fix all of the world's ills, is it not? If only you want that girl to fuck you, well, just remove all of these horrible systems of monogamy in the family unit. That's so simple, is it not? And by the way, is that not more or less exactly what the ultimate outcome of the sexual revolution and the introduction of female oral contraceptives has been in the West? Although the Great People's Revolution did not happen in the streets, it certainly did happen in the sheets, and it was supported intellectually in the universities, as they themselves were co-opted by scholars and thought leaders who were predominantly inspired by communist and Marxist writing. As again, they lost the war in the streets, they lost the Cultural Revolution. They did win the war in the ivory tower. Destroy the family, engage in free sex, and raise the children communally with an education system that instructs them on the values of those very things as necessary for the liberation of the people and the cessation of alienation and class struggle. In order to really win the war, this is how you do it. You win it by slow attrition. But before we go on to investigate the thought that followed, the thought that was based on these philosophies established by Fourier, Engels, and Marx to a lesser extent, it is important that I do note that I don't personally think that Marx himself is as much to blame for this aspect of communist thought as Engels was, because although Marx once joked in a letter to Engels, quote, "Blessed is he who has no family," Marx himself was a married man who had 7 children with his wife Jenny. And while Engels never married, given his inherent objection to the institution of marriage, as we have elaborated upon, he did cohabitate with a woman for many years. In contrast, though, Marx was known to dote upon his children and said of his favorite child Eleanor by her nickname, "Tussie is me." However, in a true twist of ironic fate, Eleanor, who would go on to most accurately live in the non-monogamous method touted by Engels and even Marx himself at times, went on to commit suicide after her cohabitating partner of years, living in protest together to the institution of marriage, ended up marrying another woman behind her back. That's right, she lived with this guy for years in protest of marriage, and then he went and married another woman, and in response, she killed herself. Welp, that non-monogamy shit sure worked out great for Eleanor Marx then, didn't it? But Aiden, all of this shit about the dissolution of the family and sexual openness, hey, that's good for women and it's good for men. It makes people more free, right? What are you, some kind of illiberal prude? Doesn't sound very libertarian of you. What does this even have to do with pedophilia in the first place, or even sexuality? Well, clearly, as I stated in the first part of this series, I'm not against premarital sex, and I do understand why there are a lot of reasons why lifelong monogamy doesn't work for two people who may ultimately grow apart. After all, when we look at monogamy in the current year, where humans tend to live to be 80 to 100 years old, is quite different from monogamy thousands of years ago, where humans lived to be 30 or 40. It does make sense why people would start to grow apart. We essentially enter massive, different portions of our lives over time. I will say this about myself though, I'm just personally not interested in non-monogamous relationships, but again, I am a libertarian, so I don't give a fuck what you do. You do you as long as you're not harming anyone else. But I don't think sexual liberation is inherently bad. It's worked out okay for me. Particularly again because I don't give a flying fuck what people do with each other's genitals, once again, as long as it is a consensual exchange between adult parties capable of decision making. Children aren't capable of accurate decision making. But we do have to look at the outcomes that have come along with it in the West, in terms of the sexual liberation movement. It's been a massive increase in divorce rates, although I must say that divorce rates have been on a downward trend for a while now. But what's not on a downward trend is the growing increase, particularly, for example, in the Black community, of out-of-wedlock births, which presents new obstacles as single-parent households tend to have numerous negative effects on child development. Hang on a second, guys, before you hit that keyboard to talk about how, hey, I'm from a single-parent household and I didn't have any of these negative effects, remember that this is what's called a statistical average. It does not refer to any individual person, nor is it a determinant, it's merely a statistical average. Including lower grades in school, a lower completion rate of higher education, a greater likelihood to get in trouble in school and be suspended, as well as all kinds of associated factors of poverty, which is more common in single-parent households. Kind of no shit, right? Including everything from a greater risk of being shot, a greater risk of breaking the law, and in the worst aspect, further, a higher risk of teen pregnancy and a terrible cyclical roundabout of behavior. Moreover, it has created or assisted in the creation of a fucked up court system system that demonizes fathers and men while giving women all of the control over sexuality and mate selection and raising of children. As I described in my videos on the K-factor, an increase potentially in risk-taking behavior is also growing, as well as an increase in mating effort, and in contrast, a decrease in reproductive effort in the West, clearly reflected and represented in the stagnation of native Western populations. Was the sexual revolution really worth it? But Fourier and Engels are only the mere beginning. After all, while Fourier supported homosexuality at a time when that term didn't even have a term, the behavior really was just called sodomy. That was about all you could describe homosexuality as at the time. Engels certainly described in Origin of the Family sodomy as, quote, an abominable practice. So let's move forward in time a bit to understand how the philosophy of Marx and Engels, influenced as it was by Fourier, would come to incorporate more ideas, given the sexually liberated framework required of the communist state and established in their writings in future works and philosophy. The most obvious and perhaps earliest example, although, if you really want to go looking into these long-term development of sexual liberation, hedonism, and even pedophilia advocacy as direct or indirect responses to the establishing thought leaders of Marx and Engels and Fourier, you'll find much more, and this is an incredibly vast topic, but the most direct and earliest one that I think you really need to look at is the German psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich, a Marxist and contemporary of Freud who based his take on psychoanalysis on the writings and beliefs both of Marx and of Freud, but particularly of Marx's concept of alienation being the origin of class and class struggle, and extended it to something he called sexual alienation. Reich, based on Freud, believed that sexuality is mostly unconscious, that small children are inherently sexual in the same manner as Freud, with the psychosexual development and fixation in children in these stages of oral, anal, and phallic from birth. That is, that children go through these stages of different types of sexual orientations. The youngest form is oral, then anal, then phallic, and if at any point something really fucked up happens in the child's life, they can become fixated on that sexual orientation, and it can cause problems later in their sexual development and cognitive development. But further, Reich posited that repressed infantile and child sexual energy was then diverted into the unconscious, similarly to Freud once again. And finally, that what we call human morality is all the result of sexual oppression of children into other energies. In adding to the ills contributed to society through the alienation of class, sexual alienation, as Reich describes it in children, then results in repression in the form of what we think of as morality, which ultimately leads to unhappiness and human irrationality. He further relates this to the works of Marx in his belief that full expression of sexuality is only available to the bourgeoisie, with their free time being totally free, and therefore they have the ability to have sex whenever they desire, while the worker, in contrast, must engage in time management, and therefore cannot be fully happy if sex is not constantly available to him or her. He further stated in his work Character Analysis that the control of our sexual instincts makes, quote, an orderly sexual life and full sexual experience impossible. That is, the person who in any way attempts to control his or her and mitigate his or her sexual desires will not only never have a full life, but will generally be unhappy and act irrationally. While his ideas were generally dismissed by mainstream communist thinkers at the time, later writers and philosophers who would expand upon his thesis of sexual pleasure and alienation would bring Reich into the forefront during the ensuing sexual revolution, when, for example, copies of his book, The Sexual Struggle of Youth, were sold door to door in dorms at the University of Paris and exploded in popularity, inciting protest even across the student population regarding their perceived repression. While Reich saw little acceptance during his life amongst the far-left leaders, others who shared his obsession with the necessity and attainment of sexual pleasure absolutely did during theirs, namely and most famously Herbert Marcuse of the Frankfurt School. Much like Reich in his book Eros and Civilization, Marcuse did more than merely include sexual alienation as a part of the class struggle, but rather totally redefined the differences in people not as a conflict of class or economics, but as a conflict of repression of sexuality specifically, which, as described by Engels in The Origin of the Family, in the replacement of the free matrilineal proto-socialist society with the repressive, classist, paternalistic family system, therefore, in Marcuse for the discussion, means that, quote, the price of progress is the prevalence of guilt instead of happiness. Marcuse, in contrast to earlier thinkers, went even further than Reich in that he believed pleasure, particularly sexual pleasure, Eros, was the be-all end-all of human existence, and that progress, all human progress and civilization, has been a denial of the pleasures of the body, that we intentionally deny the body in order to fulfill needs of society. But in the ultimate utopia, we will be able to, as Fourier said, only experience pleasure and merely maintain society basically at its current state. Moreover, Marcuse applied the fulfillment of our desires as the only goal and purpose of any life, to all desires. It's not just sexual, it's not just I like food, it's not just I want this or that, it's that any desire you have, in his perception, is rational. Marcuse states that there is no desire a human would have that is not meant to be satisfied. That is, all desires again are natural and therefore meant to be sated. Well, if it happens to include wanting to fuck an infant, certainly according to Marcuse, such a feeling, such a desire and a passion is a product of nature, and you purposefully alienate yourself, you goddamn capitalist, and you repress yourself. If you do not fulfill your desires and you repress yourself, you are engaging in the class struggle, essentially. That makes you not a very good lefty. While he would later in life publicly distance himself from Marxist thought, further, feminist hero Michael Foucault, a leader of the sexual revolution in academia, certainly mirrored the opinions of Marcuse on sexuality in that it should be free and open and expressed in any way anyone would desire. After all, it's all natural. As repression is, again, the cause of all the ills of mankind. It is the ultimate cause of the class struggle. And again, if you go back and look at Fourier and further Engels, I don't see any difference here. This is just really the foundational thought. But Foucault further made his opinion specifically on pedophilia even more evident in his creation of a petition to remove the age of consent laws in France, which was further signed by his contemporaries and other Marxist philosophers, Jean-Paul Sartre, and his long-term lover, again, they never married, Simone de Beauvoir, who would themselves both become members of the group Front de Libération des Pédophiles and engaged in disturbing grooming behavior with their various young adults that they both taught and tutored as they engaged with them sexually, either alone or as a couple, over decades. In a 1978 radio broadcast, Foucault said in relation to the petition to decriminalize sexual intercourse between adults and children under 15 that, quote, "It could be that the child, with his own sexuality, may have desired the adult. He may even have consented. He may even have made the first moves. We may even agree that it was he who seduced the adult." While his argument is not entirely repulsive, at least part of it, in that I agree with the notion as he states that, quote, "an age barrier laid down by the law does not have much sense in some principle." I don't agree with that entirely, but as I mentioned in the first part, that the notion between a 17-year-old girl and her 17-year-old boyfriend somehow becomes illegal the day that her boyfriend turns 18 is pedophilia, that's bullshit. However, this does make it clear that Foucault, who was outspoken about sexuality in other areas, particularly concerning homosexuality, being himself a gay man, with his background in Marxist thought and philosophy, and his clear exposure to the leaders who preceded him, such as Marcuse and Reich, and even far further back, once again, Fourier, it seems to go all the way up to him and his contemporaries, before we start to see sexuality and the open support of pedophilia on the left begin to gain mainstream acceptance or forwarding. But again, it all starts most directly with Marx and Engels and their insistence on the destruction of the family, and this is where it comes to its most honest and open fruition of expression. And this is still prevalent in socialist thought today. In a book I admittedly skimmed because I hate this shit, by Sherry Wolf from 2009, Socialism and Sexuality, Sherry states that there is nothing normal about monogamy, just as there is nothing abnormal about polyamory, and posits that not only is the alienation of women a direct result of the family unit, being inherently capitalist and a tool of the bourgeoisie, and obviously men, because patriarchy, but that the introduction of the family into human society, not only is it responsible for all the other shit I've talked about, but it is also the reason for the alienation of homosexuality in human society. For had it not been for the evils of inheritance, paternity, and the patriarchy, surely homosexuality would never have been perceived as abnormal, despite, being by default abnormal, representing about 1% of the fucking population, a nation that is overwhelmingly, as I believe I have illustrated, not just supportive of homosexuality, but outright championing of it, at least at this point. Further, Wolf insists in a violent and military revolt as potentially necessary to remove the final shackles of alienation, back again out of the academy and into the streets. And is that not exactly what Antifa is? The militant wing of communist and socialist thought, and really the militant wing of some mainstream leftists that despises the family, scorns monogamy, and over time has come to worship the concept of hedonism, the pleasure principle, as the only possible goal or reason for human society, the fulfillment of one's own base desires. That is the pinnacle of humanity. Well, now it's all starting to make sense, isn't it, friends? You have 2 generations of people, at least in the United States, and more than that potentially in Europe. So at least 2 generations, at least in the United States, who have gone through a university system wherein works from the likes of all of these people are taught as required reading in the academy, such as it was infiltrated after the failed Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. Therefore, is it any wonder that the expressions of sexuality have become so vast and without question or limit? Really, where does this end? Well, it doesn't end. It doesn't end because the ultimate goal, such as Marcuse and Reich, is total hedonic pleasure. The pleasure principle. After all, repression of sexuality is the true evil, the true division as Foucault, Marcuse, Reich, and even arguably at the very earliest Fourier would have posited. You have 250 years of this line of philosophy being drilled into the heads of the very youth that I described in the first video as not being fully cognitively developed, and then reinforced through the media and through their social networks of friends and relatives as this is correct. Are you a bigot? Well, you certainly are if you don't agree with this. Then, again, is it any wonder that there is an association between far-left groups like BAM and NAMBLA? I hope by this point I should have clarified why it would be more odd if they were not associated with one another. Adding a P to the word salad gay acronym is the next logical step if we look at the thought process that has led us to this point of public acceptance that we have already reached and is speeding rampantly forward toward a total eclipse of hedonism. Finally, if I did not make this clear enough before, and if people don't know this about me, I want to end this shit show by saying I don't give a fresh fuck about what you do to someone else in their bedroom personally. I really don't care. I think, as I've said multiple times, I'm a bisexual woman. I just don't give a shit. I would really prefer to conserve something about Western civilization, and part of that means conserving a family system that most thoroughly benefits the welfare of children, because that's where this shit terrifies me. I'm worried about children. I know that that's a virtue signal, but I sincerely am, and as I have provided evidence of, this is not good for children. Single-parent households are not good for children. But if it's not involving children, if you want to fuck your boyfriend in the ass all day long, I do not give a single fuck. Again, I'm bisexual. But children are not capable of consent. And moreover, when you discourage monogamy and 2-parent households, it has negative effects on children, as we see time and time again. The research is fairly consistent. And when you start fucking with child development, both in the home and pedagogically, you are now stepping on someone else's rights. And I cannot abide that ethically nor at some point legally. I think this shit is without question child abuse. And we talk about cognitively deficit teenagers making the decision, for example, to cut off their own genitals because being trans is totally awesome and popular. You are not talking about potentially ruining that child's entire life. Do you know to what extent, motherfuckers? Legitimate trigger warning for what I'm about to say here. Trans women have to sit, often in extreme pain, and dilate their artificial vaginas with dildos for up to 5 times a day for months after sex reassignment surgery, and must continue to spend between 20 minutes to an hour dilating at least once a week for the rest of their lives. Hair frequently grows inside the artificial vagina, which needs to be manually plucked. Urination is usually messy and potentially highly embarrassing because it gets all over the place. Here's some fucked up shit. They will continue often to get erections, particularly if at any point they stop taking their hormones, which causes an uncomfortable or even incredibly painful swelling of the artificial labia, given that it is made with penile tissue. And regardless of what the mainstream narrative may be, trust me, there are plenty of people who regret transitioning. I think, for some people it's the best thing we can do for you. I wish we could give you a pill. Maybe this is the best thing for some. But given what I've just described, that's kind of a no shit some people regret this. And you want to do this with 16-year-olds while calling me the repressive bigot? Fuck you. You're an abusive monster. Anyway, I hope I've explained the ideological history and evolution of the far left support of free sexuality, including potentially the acceptance of pedophilia, or at least the normalization of the sexualization of children, and why we should not only not be shocked, but we should outright expect the left to move further and further toward adding that P to their litter clusterfuck of acceptance and tolerance. If you enjoyed this video, which you probably should not have given how incredibly fucked up it all was, but if you did enjoy it, I'm Aiden Paladin, all time a Volt.